All right, everyone. I believe this next segment, I get to host a very distinguished panel of leaders that are going to be taking on just a few questions. I think a reflection from Dr. Hill's talk. Just a quick introduction myself. Once again, I'm Reverend Rifat Mott. I pastor Generations Church here in New Rochelle, New York, and I'm privileged to facilitate this session. Just a quick interview and just some rules of engagement, or quick introduction rather. We have Reverend Dennis Dillon, which is the distinguished publisher of the Christian Times. I believe he's holding down the city of Brooklyn, the man of peace there. Reverend Philip Park, president of the Asian American Association. He's going to be sitting in on this discussion, adding value from, I believe, the Asian perspective. As well, Reverend Dr. Jeffrey Barker, the executive director of the Palmer Institute. I'm going to just take, I think we have an hour or so. And what I want to do with our time is I've composed 3 questions for the panelists, and each panelist will have an opportunity to answer each of the questions posed in turn. And of course, if time permits, additional commentary can be added. But what we're going to do now is just kind of allow for their voices to be heard. I believe each of these men have a perspective, and they bring great value to this discussion of racial reconciliation. And the goal of this symposium, and it's really to address how can the church be an agent of reconciliation in the post-George Floyd world. So obviously the questions, I've tried to compose them to as much as possible, cover the gamut, I think, of what I think would bring value to this symposium, and leave those of you who are here with some answers to the questions that you may have been wrestling with about how to engage in this world. I will say this, that it is difficult. It's almost like no matter what we do as pastors and leaders, you're going to create some kind of friction with some group in your church. And so leading through this time has clearly been very, very difficult and extremely challenging, no matter where you are in the world. You are forced to take position on issues that you may or may not have had expertise in prior to. And so it has been a challenging time indeed. But I believe that, we've heard some good things from Dr. Hill today. And of course, now our panelists will get a chance to speak and to respond to the questions that I've posed. So here goes the first question I'm going to ask. And Reverend Dillon will go first, Reverend Barker, and then Reverend Park will take this first question. So the first question is this. In some church circles, the topic of racial reconciliation has always been a part of the conversation, although not always a part of our practice. How are some ways that this post-George Floyd era has helped or hurt efforts to move our conversation and reconciliation efforts forward? In other words, describe what, if any, good has come from it, or how it might have made things more difficult for us to talk about reconciliation. Reverend Dillon.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Martin. We certainly appreciate your guidance and your leadership. And I just want to take a quick moment to salute Reverend Gabidon and the entire team for bringing this forum together. And my salute to my fellow panelists. I just want to make the point that what the George Floyd situation has done, it has clearly created the room for the conversation, or it has heightened the need for the conversation and for the dialogue. And I would that we journey to the place where we really confront the issues and really deal with them head on. And I think that's what this symposium is doing. So the answer to your question essentially is in this very symposium, because now there is a conversation about post-George Floyd era. So very clearly so, I must say that as, in addition to being a preacher and a minister of the gospel, as a journalist, I have written many pieces around the George Floyd situation and what grew out of the George Floyd situation. So I'm excited about the conversation and around the dialogue. I think the church is at a place where many of what we have failed to confront, there is an increasing need and desire to confront those things. We're finding that particularly our young people, when we go back and we look at the massive so-called Black Lives Matter movement, and I say so-called because it is not just Black young people that are engaged in this movement. It is young people from all across the globe of all races, stripes, and colors. And so there is that aggressive movement that's affront. So I do believe that we are at that stage and that place where we are now recognizing the important need of addressing the issue of racism, the issue of racial reconciliation, and the point must be made and noted. And this is where I think the church and the voices of the prophetic leaders across the country and around the globe really come in. And that is, we got to understand how key and critical the issue of justice is in all of this. When the word of God in Isaiah chapter 28, I think it is, and it's probably close to verse 28 as well, it talks about righteousness as the plumb line and the justice as the measuring line. I think we're at that place where everything now needs to be measured in terms of righteousness, a plumb line, which speaks of a vertical relationship with God, and the measuring line, which speaks of a horizontal relationship with each other.
Excellent. Though I did not state it, we have 3 to 5 minutes to respond. You are right in the pocket, and I thank you for that. So let me ask you, since you have like a minute, do you feel that in any way at all, we see the positives growing from out of the movement? Do you see any unintended, maybe negative consequences that may have made reconciliation more challenging or the conversation tougher?
Yeah, I think there is no doubt. Yes, I do. I think there's still a huge element within our community, and I'm talking about our faith community. More specifically, I'm talking about our cleric community, the community of faith leaders, where we are more resistant. You've got some children who they become more stubborn when they're confronted with certain issues. You think they would change and adjust, and they become more difficult. And I think we're seeing an element of that also needs to be confronted. And so how do we do that? How do we change our language? And Dr. Hill, spoke to this, the insidious and the subliminal messages that are being conveyed. How do we correct and how do we fix them? And I'll make this quick point in the introduction of our guest preacher, and again, not to be taken the wrong way, but the idea of the George Floyd incident is a major problem for me. The George Floyd murder, the George Floyd crisis, the George Floyd injustice was not an incident. Dictionary.com describe an incident as an embarrassing occurrence, an occurrence of seemingly minor importance. So we got to also watch our language. And the George Floyd situation, crisis, murder was not an incident. And so how do we begin to look at how we change the language and how do we make sure that we're getting it right this time?
Good, very good, excellent. Dr. Barker, your opportunity, same question. How do you feel this has helped the conversation in our efforts to reconciliation or harmed it? And if so, kind of outline for us some of the ways that it has.
Thank you. And like Reverend Dillon has mentioned, right, it's just an honor to be in this conversation, that it has opened this space for this. And Dr. Hill, your framework and your comments, I think, situate this in a fresh way, in a new way, in a potential way to move further down the road in response to what we see around ourselves. And so I think that the help hurt question is really just opposite sides of the same coin, right? There are certain things that I think from, and I'll just use Dr. Hill's language of self-location here, of kind of where I am in all of this, right? So from my vantage point, I think there's been a facade of ecclesial or racial harmony in some kind of way that was really a facade and not a deep and meaningful reconciliation among the people of God. So I think it revealed that us within the larger communities and neighborhoods in which we find ourselves, I think that's true, but even in the church, among the people of God, that it kind of unmasked a friendliness, but not a reconciled people in all of that. And I think it also then has revealed a lack of ecclesial imagination that has then defaulted to these postures of other groups giving voice to or direction to, right? The church hasn't had and hasn't cultivated an ecclesial imagination to help lead a people to a new reality. I'll use the word kind of politically hijacked, right? So we then either align ourselves politically with different groups because in some ways, again, from my social location, I'd say the church has lacked an imagination, a holy imagination, a biblical imagination, a theological imagination, an ecclesial imagination to move forward. And so I think the good that has come out of this then is it outlines us for a path to move forward away from just bifurcated thinking of you have to be either this or this, you have to partner with this group or that group. So thank you.
Dr. Barker, that was very good. Both of your responses have been very good. I will reserve any comment until I hear from Reverend Philip Park, our Asian brother. Is going to just share an answer to the same question. The whole issue of reconciliation in the church has been in our conversation, but not as much in our practice. How has this post-George Floyd world made that conversation and our efforts easier or more challenging? Reverend Park.
It is my privilege to have this divine opportunity to share with you as looks like a representative from the Asian American churches and communities. It's the very first time to connect with you this symposium, and it seems for me it's time to inform you what Asian American church and communities for their conversation and reconciliation effort forward, and that renewing their perspective on racism and reconciliation. Since then, George Floyd has come a symbol of police violence against Black people, and the Black Lives Matter slogans around the Asian community as well have been heard everywhere with his image. At the same time, there was a collective movement of Asian American in this regard. Asian slogans such as Asian Lives Matter and Stop Hating Asians Worldwide. However, Asian Americans believe that the Black Lives Matter movement was able to resonate so much globally because all races had one united voice on the issue of Black rights. So, one of the necessary solutions to the problem of the hate crime against the Asian, they have learned and renewed the awareness that not only the unity of Asians themselves, but also engagement of other ethnic societies and communities and has become more important. And the equal treatment Asian Americans still enjoy in this land, United States today, came at the cost of the sacrifice made by so many Black people. And we are learning. And no matter also how the Asian tried to deny it, it made them realize that they are minority in this land anyway. in the midst of this, the Asian American Christian communities have started to come up with a practical alternative to eradicate crime. For example, Asian American Christian Collaborative makes many good programs start since George Floyd accident and kind of so many webinar. And then the Council of Korean Churches of Greater New York, CKC, amplifying the voices, issues, and histories of Asian America in the church and society locally and nationwide. Particularly the National Conference of Korean Presbyterian Church, NCKPC, recently sent the official document to local government asking them to come up with legislation to prohibit racial discrimination. So this kind of effort since George Floyd accident coming out and more Asian American community churches involved and start so different way to do it. Especially in the area of severe discrimination and conflict, all Asian American religious circles have come to realize that the role of the church is more important than ever. So in order to overcome the challenges of this time wisely, it has cultivated to the opportunity for Asian American Christians to first repent themselves and awaken themselves about the racial discrimination in the church that is rooted in them, and then work hard to actually get rid of it more and more. And then in addition, Asian American churches, they pledged to work in solidarity so that the voices of the social disadvantaged who have been living in silence for so long can be heard and can be seen. At the same time, knowing that to remain silent on racism is to sympathize with the injustice. Now they are calling for action as well as raising their voices for justice in any form. So the Korean and Chinese American local churches take the lead in helping victims of hating crimes and discrimination, and they are putting it into practice aggressively. They also agree that solidarity and the cooperation partnership of all members the churches and ethnic cities or races are important so that other racial conflict do not arise. Then lastly, at the same time, Asian American churches began to use their voice in the way of peace as taught by Jesus, rather than being a minority who simply conforms to this reality. There is, however, a consensus that we should strive to do things that in a way that resist and does not retaliate against the violence as Jesus taught, not additionally. So this is all just our Asian American perspective I want to share.
Appreciate it very much. What I hear you saying is that, yes, this George Floyd era has created open doors, opportunities. It started needful conversations, not only in the Black-white community, but also in the Asian community. And it has also moved your community to take steps towards linking arms and walking in solidarity with us and with others. And that is in summary what I hear you saying. And I certainly want to applaud that. And I hope that those of us who are listening take note. I think that for someone from an immigrant community that represents a minority, but a prosperous minority that comes to this church, it's easy to get locked into your own world and into your own culture because it's so rich and there's so much happening there. But to hear you say that in this forum has great value. It really does. So we thank you. We thank you for that. All right, very good insight so far. I hope you all are taking notes. I want to get to two more questions if we can. And if Dr. Hill is still here, if at any point in time you would like to respond or speak into one of these things, Dr. Hill, also we would welcome that. Dr. Hill talked about the need to break with cultural norms. That's a big theme in the book, and he did spend some time dealing with that today in his talk, which I so greatly appreciate. He talked to us to talk about the need for us to, like Jesus, move beyond our palace relationships, the places that we are most comfortable, and to engage others outside our comfortable church and cultural circles. Now, in your experience, Reverend Dillon, what has been some successes or failures that you might have had in doing this? Talk about, if you would, some of your challenges in relating cross-culturally in your context.
And it's a great question, and the idea of breaking cultural norms, the idea of moving beyond a single homogeneity to really, bring about a multicultural church, a multicultural Christian community is great in theory. The problem, particularly in these United States of America, is that there is what we call a Black church. And obviously, if there's a Black church, there's a white church, there is a Korean church, there is a Latino church. Let me tell you the reason why there is a Black church. There's a church in Harlem called Abyssinian Baptist Church. The way that church started was First Baptist Church, which is now on Broadway at about 70-something street. That church did not allow Black people to go sit in the pew where you like to worship God. Couldn't sit in the front. They had to go to the balcony to sit. That's the only place they could worship and pray to the same God. So they obviously recognize we can't even serve God freely here. So they went and started Abyssinian Baptist Church. When we look at the formation of the AME Church, the AME Zion Church, we can go back to Philadelphia and talk about Bethel Church, and Black people could not worship. So again, Richard Allen had to go and start his own ministry where they could. So the end result, and we could give tons of examples all across the United States, is now Black people are worshiping because they were not allowed to pray with white people, sit in church and worship God freely. And so that got created. I think the healing now has to take place in order for there to be this coming back together. And white folks, white churches, white organizations are yet to properly, and I add the word properly, make amends and fix all of these things that they've made wrong. So the end result is that you still have Black people coming together, worshiping by themselves, and whites. The reality in a lot of cases, let me give one other practical example. A church in Brooklyn, New York, started many years ago, a white pastor, a white congregation, and white Blacks start moving into the congregation, Latinos start moving into the congregation. Before long, all the whites in that congregation has left that congregation. So it remained a church with a white pastor, but today, that church is a majority Black, Latino, and other races. The white folks they've taken flight. So I really think to solve this problem, we have to journey back to the white leadership, making some amends, correcting some things, and re-educating their community about some of these issues so that we could create the kind of cultural and ethnic and racial diversity that we're talking about. It's sad and troubling for me that the church is ethnically and racially divided while we are theologically united.
That is it. That is in fact a dilemma. I honestly, as a person who's an immigrant and who shares a mixed heritage of my mother's Jamaican, my father's Cuban. I understand immigrants and I understand culture. I understand the powerful language to unite or the lack thereof to also be a point of division. I also believe, though, for us as Christians, I don't know, I think there's only one race. There are many ethnicities and diversity of culture, which should be celebrated. I just celebrate the human race. I think we really need to even begin to reshape the language of how we speak about race. But I appreciate the challenges that you shared there, Reverend Dillon. They're real, and we may not be able to overcome all of them. I still think that some people will still gather where they feel most comfortable. I think what's important is friendship. Anyway, Dr. Barker, would you also speak to that question for us? The issue of, relating cross-culturally, being intentional about that, and what are, if any, challenges you may have experienced, or some triumphs maybe in that area?
I certainly hear Reverend Dillon's call here, and it is important for us to identify how we have arrived to our present circumstance. And so, again, coming back and saying, what has this series of events that have kind of galvanized together in identifying, say, an incident that is more than just a one-time thing, I think is part of this naming reality, right? How have we arrived where we are, and then what do we do with all of that? And that's I think the question on the table now for us as we think through this. And again, I think Dr. Hill is trying to evoke this imagination for us, that we're not locked into our socioeconomic or our ethnic groups, but that we're somehow imagining a kingdom, a way of living and being that moves us in almost in the world, but not of the world, right? Somehow a parallel reality of how we even talk about these things, and not just a moderating voice between two extremes, but somehow there's a whole nother story that we're living and embodying that demands an imagination that I think has been broken in the church. And I think part of that brokenness is framed by Reverend Dillon's narrative that highlights that this is how we've gotten here, and this is where we are, and there's complicity in that. And I recognize that as a member of a particular expression of the church, right? That I am complicit in that, and commit myself to working toward this vision of the kingdom in a significant way. So as you presented that question, I'm really thinking about it in really maybe as Dr. Hill's talking about, kind of there's this personal step that has to be taken before even organizations or institutions can move forward in these kinds of ways. And I think the showing up, I've often talked about it as intentionally entering into other spaces. That it's risky, that it's hard. There's always the possibility of assumptions, even especially for myself, moving into places where I come with power, right? I come with identities in particular ways that may compromise that. But for myself, I've been tutored, I've been taught to pay attention to what I feel when I move into these spaces, right? Well, and then to explore what assumptions or beliefs are linked to those particular feelings in that kind of way. And so because of the role that I have on the Metro New York District of the Church of the Nazarene, we have well over 100 churches worshiping multiple languages, and it is expressive of some of what Reverend Dillon has talked about. But I have to pay attention to why do I feel particular ways moving into some congregations and other feelings moving into other congregations, and why is that? And sometimes it's my own fear of offending in some kind of way, because I don't know how to operate or what to say. Some of it is I walk into a congregation that is worshiping in another language, and I have no idea what is even going on. And so am I going to make some kind of major blunder and offend an entire people unintentionally? And so I have to pay attention to what those feelings are, and certainly the language issue, right? How do we navigate some of those spaces? Because even translation isn't this word for word, idea for idea, because there are whole language systems that aren't even necessarily compatible as we think about it. We don't have shared words that we can work with. And so I think as Dr. Hill has tried to move us through this, there's a humility. I have to recognize my own social location and then pay attention to what I may be experiencing or feeling as we move into that place especially with the long history that Reverend Dillon has talked about, right? That's a shadow that's over us, that as we make these moves, we have to be mindful of and purposeful in. Then what does this reconciliation really look like? And it begins with the notion that there was conciliation in the first place, right? That there was this vision of us as the people of God. So those certainly probably more failures than successes, but a tutoring that to pay attention, right? To move into spaces, to pay attention, and to recognize the realities that are shaping us in different ways.
Thank you so much, Dr. Barker. Dr. Hill, before I go to Reverend Park, was there something you wanted to chime in on that?
Sure, I just think it's so well said, the posture, and I'm thankful for just the different insights. This conversation has brought a lot to the forefront, and what I've even learned is that a lot of times when I come in from what I would call a peacemaking narrative, if a heart is angry or offended, it can seem like being soft or compromising. So I have to brush that off and not really pay much attention to it because some people are hurt and they're upset. And boy, how embarrassing would it be to be a leader or a pastor and have a great vision for unity, only to have doors shut in your face. And it definitely purifies our hearts in the process on all sides, to keep our trust in God for this unity and not man. But I love the fact that we have the opportunity to walk in that humility that Dr. Barker was saying, because I think some of my favorite moments in sharing the dream clock is when my own friends of my same ethnic group come in the room, and they, because I'm Black, because the topic is around race, the assumption is, okay, now it's time to tell the white people what the problem is. I mean, that's the assumption. Even when I go into different settings, corporate America too, I can just tell, okay, dark skinned Black, he's talking about race. He's about to put shame on all of us. But one of the assumptions is assuming that it's all the other group and that none of the blind spots are my own, and that all the problems I have are other people. And it's like, okay, well, what about the God factor? We just said God was with us, but then we said they stopped us. So where are we going to land? So I just wanted to put a highlight on just the simple fact that, yes, this has brought opportunity, but to go back to the scriptures and raise that up. And the thing that I saw that hurt us is that people are actually reinforcing their political positions. Like, no, let's review the word so we can do 2 Chronicles 7:14 and say, what have I done in this process? Clarence, did you have any selective sight? Did you give up because you got offended when maybe a wealthy person didn't you didn't talk long enough, in your opinion, and you saw them over there talking to somebody else that looked like them way longer? What else? No, Clarence, look in your own book and say, do you need repentance? And I think just acknowledging what if God actually would breathe in if all of us humbled ourselves? That's a piece of it too.
Thank you so much. I appreciate you chiming in there. That is good. Thank you for staying on with us as well. Reverend Park, if you can, in about 2 minutes or so, can you tell us in your experience what has been some of the successes that you've had or some failures that you've experienced in trying to go out of your circle? I know you have a lot of experience ministering cross-culturally from your missionary background, so your voice matters powerfully here.
Thank you. Since 1990 and to the present, I have experienced, like you said, cross-cultural missionary work in different nations, mission field in the 6 countries in Asia, along with the mission teams from various countries, including USA, for 16 years. And I have been serving Asian American ministry and senior pastor of a New York Queens Flushing First Church cross-culturally and then multiculturally last 15 years in New York. It's to experience all the time in making many different new experience and new concept for the future. But there are 3 key words I want to share with you. Is last 32 years, my missionary life, it always been deeply ingrained in my mind, and that the three words that understand, engagement, and contextualization. Three keyword always challenging, and then have to get over it. Today, Dr. Hill's message is everything there, especially race to Jesus. We're talking about race to Jesus. I just immediately come to my mind this team race to Jesus. It's not just individually to go to race to Jesus, but it's a team race. So that means we have to understand each other as team and engage each other, and then especially sufficiently understand, not just to say, oh, I understand you, but talking about Asian culture, as you know, it's a relationship-oriented culture. Western culture is trust-oriented culture. So we need both, learning both different perspective as a cross. And because cross culture means we have to accept, you have to understand other side of a way to approach. It's not just, here I'm just come first time this symposium as Korean minister, and I feel like very welcomed and connected, and then also learning a lot. Especially, I try to understand. I try to not just one side understand, mutual understand each other between this community and myself. But it is difficult to reconcile without deep understanding each other. Understanding word of understanding means to stand below, stand under. That means today we're talking about humiliation, humbly lowering yourself, looking at the other person. Can you understand him? And then can understand properly. When everyone looks like we are leadership or whatever, we are higher eyes level than other person, and they have a pride and arrogance, they can understand with the reason, but not with their heart. So basis of understanding is humility and love we're talking about today. Like an example, Jesus coming to the world, Jesus incarnation, understanding principle he did for us first. So today, just to, mutual understanding, in order to mutual understanding, I want to say we have to, today I love to hear Dr. Hill's or Clark's message, especially it looks like making me all my 32 years missionary experience making one in the one clap. And then I can really appreciate you gave me a good insight. But one thing finally I want to tell you, the understanding level, I like to say today, knowing, doing, being, that love is central, is balance. We have to three things balance out to understand other culture, other races. Finally, you say that hi and hello is important in your lecture, Dr. Hill. To give you a practical example of this, when you are living in the age of social distancing right now and communication where you are speaking as little as possible during the pandemic, and when you go to meeting or this kind of meeting place where communication, not well communicate in English, and the expression that can show God's love, you have to, how you can do that, how for knowing, doing, being, and then in the short period of time. I think this is, I just want to give one tip. We need to have Christ-like smile.
That's good.
Like, hi, hello, Christ-like smile. So that's I want to share with you the practical. We have to have that. Otherwise, the people then they do not want to even approach you. So that's the people need to see and need to show up that way.
Thank you so much, Reverend Park. Again, the theme of friendship continues to be echoed here in Dr. Hill. It's something that I strongly believe in. I think that pastors generally, whatever culture I think people usually feel threatened when you approach them to build a relationship with them because they think you're after something more than just plainly friendship. And quite frankly, I think friendship has great value. I think it lets the other pastor know that I'm here for you. If you need someone to pray with you, to listen to you, that's what I'm here for. I don't want anything from you. I just want you to know that I'm in your corner and I don't wish you evil. I'm not here to compete with you. I think just to take away that sense of whatever threat you may represent to them in itself is very powerful. I see some questions that are coming in here on the chat, and I want to give some time to it. I do have one panel question left. So here's the last question that I have scripted for the panelists. Frame it this way. So in the post-George Floyd era, it has been marked by division and strife, not only over racial issues, but over politics. And even more recently, over the COVID vaccine. This division has had a visible and polarizing effect on the church and placed many pastors under undue pressure to respond. However, many felt ill-equipped to speak about racial and political issues and have lost members because of whatever position they eventually chose to take. With another election fast approaching, what are some of the things that pastors and congregation leaders can do to avoid further polarization of the church? Reverend Dillon, I'll let you speak first.
I'm leaving Selma right now. This weekend in Selma has really been one around healing for the people of Selma, for the Black community across these United States. We go back to 1965, what is called Bloody Sunday, when Blacks were just beaten up and eventually one person got killed in the process. So we're dealing with all of this. I want to really make the point about the wave right now of Asian hate, Jewish hate. The Defamation League came out and talked about the rise in Jewish hate right now in this season, Latino, Mexican hate. And for some reason, when we go back from a political perspective, very briefly, and we reflect on the Chinese virus and how that fueled a high degree of the Asian hate, the Mexicans are criminals and rapists, how that fueled anti-Mexican, anti-Latino hate, and the perpetuation of these levels of resentment that has been so greatly politically motivated. And I find for some reason that when we look at the dynamics of the Black church, the white church, Black preachers, the white preachers, and the fact that most Blacks are Democrats, most Black preachers vote Democratic, does that mean that they're less Christians? Most whites vote Republicans. Most white ministers vote Republican. Does that make them less Christian? It raises real issue, but for me, the alignment and association with those who would perpetuate hate from the perspective of humanity is bothering and troublesome for me. So I believe that what the church must do, the church needs to call a national conference on racial healing and racial reconciliation. And I believe that there are too many silent voices, and it's not a 2022 situation. Dr. Martin Luther King talked about the silence of the white church and the white preachers back in the 1960s, and they're still silent. So the point is, at one point, will the voices of the white church, the voices of white ministers join forces to say, we stand with Asians, we stand with the Blacks, we stand in the interest of racial healing and racial reconciliation. I really think those issues have remained greatly unaddressed. And for me, that's the path to repentance and to get us where we need to be as a people.
Man, that is rich. And I'm riding with you in a lot of stuff that you said. I just started wondering when you mentioned calling this national conference, how do we move forward from here? We're having this great conversation here, and I think that may have some relevance, but how do we take what we're doing here to the place where it can become, or who will rise? Who will be the voice for the evangelical church? We have no pope. Who will arise and say, hey, let's make this happen and let's do it now? So that's a provocative question. And before I go to the next one, and I think someone asked a question here about how do we move forward? And I think this is kind of like what we're dealing with. So maybe Dr. Hill, you would like to chime in on that question. Really, how do we address what to me is a growing chasm? And it's very pronounced upon the church. And if we're supposed to be the agent of change for the world, how do we present ourselves when we ourselves are so divided and we are so fragmented? Can you speak to that for us a little bit?
Oh, thank you. Wonderful. I mean, you're a dynamic host, by the way. Don't despise small beginnings. One of the things that the Dream Clock helps is it gives a framework so that if I have a leader who may be one of the thems in my us, them natural world, not in the kingdom, but in my natural world, what class is us, them. And let's say they're at 1 o'clock. They don't do 2 o'clock, or they don't do 3 o'clock. They don't show up in other spaces. What that does for me in dealing with leaders is I don't have to treat them or have expectations of someone who would be at 6 o'clock. If they have not served in another community under the leadership of a different ethnic group, if they've never been in that place before, it will not register because they've been so polarized. The only other dialogue, it's just like telling someone to go to Indonesia and speak the native language when they're from Russia. It's like they've never been around it. They don't know the customs, that there's no framework up there. So to have expectations for a 6 o'clock response, just back off from that. But then go to our power in Christ, where to not despise small beginnings. Name for me the professors of the universities in Jesus' day. Name for me the Rockefellers or the Jeff Bezos and Elon Musk of Jesus' day. We don't know who they are, but we do know who the small beginnings, those fishermen, that tax collector, we know the unnamed. And so what I'm saying is, yes, we would love everybody to have the 12 o'clock commitment, but what the Dream Clock allows us to do is to go completely grassroots. What we're saying right now is this is the kingdom of heaven. This is a multi-ethnic conversation going on right now. This is Bishop Reefer Mott. He is driving toward this conversation. So to me, when we ask God for something, I think the big key to prayer is gratitude, which is acknowledging what he has done. Because sometimes we go into complaint mode and then we act, and God is like, I've raised up 300 reconcilers. Now they move the needle this much, but have we praised God for the reconciliation that has happened? Have we praised God for the fact that this is happening enough so that we can value these contributions? Then start from there saying, hey, the whole kingdom effort is the little rock that hit the side of the great vision that Daniel had, and it destroyed these huge kingdoms. I would say we are in the midst of a move of God, and to not lose heart, because I think this would be maybe even a potential correction in our thinking. Until the great politicians and the pastors with the biggest churches say something, nothing's happening. And Jesus said, no, I'm finished when I grabbed a bunch of no-name fishermen. And I just released the kingdom on the whole earth. So I think we're farther than we think.
That's powerful. And in line with what you're saying there, Dr. Hill, I was also thinking, I read one commentator pushing back on the idea that Jesus did not institute a new covenant. And I said, well, what is this that we see here in the upper room? And I realized that as brilliant as that commentator was, it simply was, one, it was a bias, a theological bias. But secondly, I think it was because we tend not to see things that didn't happen with the the big guys. It didn't happen with the high priest and the ruling class. So what happens in a small upper room with 12 no-name guys, what impact could that possibly have on the world, right? Literally. And I think it's the same kind of thinking. Dr. Barker, if you don't mind, I'm going to kind of go with that same question for you. Talk to me a little bit about how does the church avoid, how do we go forward in this already, widening chasm? How do we avoid further polarization? How should congregation leaders, lead in this season of division?
The challenge I think that pastors and church leaders are up against, right, is that we tell and share our Christian story and identity a couple of hours a week, and we're backlogged with other political identities and other things, nonstop, right? It's just pounding away. And I think sometimes our congregants, even pastors ourselves, right, we latch on to those identities as primary identities. And so I think as local pastors, I think the work is in Christian formation, right? How do we really take in some of the outline that certainly Dr. Hill has offered us here, but recover this notion of Christian formation at the heart of our work as ecclesial communities, right? That we are grounding ourselves in the biblical narrative and ecclesial imagination to say that I'm neither A nor B, because neither A nor B really reflect the totality of who I am as a follower of Jesus, right? And that I am independent from those identities, right? That in some ways I'm not going to live in this bifurcated world that places people over here and some people over here. And so I think, certainly our conversation has talked about ethnic identity, ethnic groups and wealth classes, but perhaps there might even be a conversation here about gender, right? Of men and women, and how all of this is playing out in this kind of way, and that maybe there are some blind spots in our rear view mirrors relative to gender, right? And what does this mean for us in this conversation as we move forward? So I think in a microcosm, right, on a micro level of a local church, I think it is cultivating an ecclesial imagination among a group of followers, as Dr. Hill has identified here, and that we celebrate this, right? We celebrate that we are part of God's redeeming work in this season of life, in this particular location in the world, and that the way I say it, we gamble everything on Jesus, right? We put all our chips in with Jesus. And we say this is who we are, and we believe the same things that Paul talked about of reconciliation, right? Of breaking down the barriers between people, and that we commit ourselves to some of this. So it's not, I don't have concrete things but it's returning to prayer, it's study of scripture, it's Christian community, of sharing table, some of those very basic practices we have. Sorry, I took probably more time than I was allowed.
No, that's all right. We are up against the clock, and I've got to wrap this. And I hate to do that, but I must respect the time because this is such a rich and so charged and so well-needed conversation. We didn't get to hear from Dr. Park on this, but I've got to give the time back to Reverend Gabbin. But I want to say that we should probably do this again really soon. And I also want to take it upon myself to say, if you have not read Dr. Hill's book, Race to Jesus, or The Dream Clock, I think it is a handbook. Literally, it is the manifesto. It is everything that you need, I think, to help pastors and leaders walk through this next season and to create that dream, cast a bigger vision for the church and for our place as an agent of healing and reconciliation in the world. I think that book holds many of the answers. So to all of us listening here, I don't know whether that book is being offered, but I want to take a moment and plug that book on his behalf. I've read many books on race. This one right here is saying, okay, we hear you. Here's the answer. Follow Jesus. All right, Dr. Hill, thank you so much for staying with us. Thank you for your time with us. Reverend Gabidon, thank you for creating this forum and allowing us to have this conversation. I hope everyone receives something, and I know we're going to go to our prayer closets now. Turn it back over to you. God bless you.